Well, I think we might make a start. Welcome to Navigate to Home, a webinar to launch and discuss the National 9 Principles for Strengthening Renters' Rights, a significant and very timely new report by NARO, National Association of Renters Organisations. I'm Peter Mayers. I'm an independent writer and researcher on public policy issues, including housing. I often write about housing for the magazine Inside Story, and I'm very pleased that NARO has invited me to facilitate this important discussion. Wherever we join this webinar from, we're on the lands of Australia's First Nations peoples. I'm on the country of the Wadawurrung peoples of the Eastern Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to Wadawurrung elders past and present and recognise their enduring custodianship of and care for this place. And I extend that recognition to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples throughout Australia and to any First Nations colleagues who are joining us on the call today. These lands that we now call Australia were never ceded, and I echo the aspiration of the Uluru Statement from the Heart that with truth-telling, treaty and voice, this ancient sovereignty will one day shine through as a fuller expression of Australia's nationhood. I note too that when we speak about housing and tenants' experiences in the rental market, we should keep in the forefront of our minds that statistically speaking, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are far more likely than other Australians to be at the pointy end, at the sharp end of our housing crisis, far more likely to be subjected to discrimination in the housing market, to live in rental stress or in severely overcrowded homes, or to experience housing insecurity and indeed homelessness. This is a very timely conversation, as I said, given the commitment made at National Cabinet to forge a better deal for renters, to harmonise and strengthen renters' rights across Australia. It's a promising and welcome initiative, but to deploy two cliches in one go, the devil will be in the detail and the proof will be in the pudding. And I'm sure that any substantial reforms to create a decent and uniform set of tenancy laws around Australia is going to require continued strong advocacy and pressure from everyone on today's call. To help us think through the issues, NARO has not only published a great report, but lined up a terrific panel of speakers. We're going to hear from New South Wales Rental Commissioner Trina Jones, from Victorian Rental Commissioner Heather Holst, from Melisa Coveney from Darwin Community Legal Services, and Daniel Pritchard from Circle Green Community Legal in Western Australia. And I'll introduce you to each of them more fully when they come to speak about the challenges facing renters and to explore solutions and priorities for a national tenancy reform agenda. And in a moment, I'll introduce NARO's convener, Penny Carr, to provide you with an overview of the National 9 and the key principles that NARO has come up with or identified for strengthening renters' rights. And then we'll get responses from our four panelists, and I'll open it up to your questions. So if you'd like to pose a question at any time, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom webinar screen. We've also got the comment function, the chat function open, and so we want you to be able to share messages with each other and chat to each other's. Put comments in there as well if you like, but if you want to put a question to a panelist or to all the panel, then please use the Q&A function so I can see it. To kick us off, we have a short message from the Federal Minister for Housing and Homelessness, Julie Collins. NARO did invite Julie Collins to join this discussion. She was unable to join us in person, but she did send this short message. And thank you to Julie Collins, Federal Minister for Housing and Homelessness. And indeed, I think one of the topics for our conversation will be how well the better deal for renters as it currently stands meshes with the 9 principles that are in the National 9 developed by NARO. So it's my pleasure now to introduce NARO convener, Penny Carr. Penny, I'm sure well known to most of you, is CEO of Tenants Queensland, and she's worked in the community sector for more than 30 years, acquiring a vast knowledge of tenancy law and of tenants' experiences of renting. So Penny's going to give us an overview of the National 9 Principles for Strengthening Renters' Rights. Penny.
Thanks very much, Peter. And I want to acknowledge that I'm coming to you today from the lands of the Turrbal and Yagara people. lands that were never ceded, and just underscore something that you said, Peter, which is that renting issues have a particular impact on our First Nations people because they're much more likely to be renters and very likely to be living in the private rental market. Just to introduce NARO, the National Association of Renters Organisations, we're a federation of state and territory tenant unions and tenant advice services across Australia. We're made up of Tenants Queensland, Tenants Union of New South Wales, Tenants Victoria, Circle Green Legal Centre and Darwin Community Legal Centre. We're the country's leading voice representing the interests of people who rent their homes in our respective jurisdictions and come together to speak nationally on these issues. We're experts in the application of residential tenancy laws. We advise, support and advocate for tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of renters and households annually. This report is to provide expert guidance for the national proposals that have been developed and hopefully will be further developed by National Cabinet and Housing Ministers. We're here to advocate for a better deal for renters, a better protection in our rental housing system, and to ensure that all renters have access to safe, affordable and secure homes. Renting has become a much more important issue as the role of the rental market and how people and how long they rent has changed over the years. We now have people who rent for significant periods of time, if not their whole lives. Young people are much less likely to be entering home ownership and increasingly remain in the rental market. We're raising children in the rental market. Almost half of our rented homes have dependent children in them, and people are ageing in the rental market. The rental market is playing a significant and different role than it used to play when some of our laws were formed and saw it as a transitional tenure between a place where you lived with your family of origin and you were on the way to purchasing your own home. For the last few years, and acutely during the COVID-19 pandemic, and then the years as we've emerged, the key issues for renting households become into an even sharper focus. Historically and widespread low vacancy rates, spiralling rents for both new tenancies and sitting tenants have pushed renting households into the brink or into homelessness. At the same time, renters experience insecurity and their tenure may be in poor quality, and their costs of living may be pushed up because of those qualities. In trying to deliver our report, we've come together nationally, and you should see this report as a floor and not a ceiling. For some people today, some of the issues in our report might be surprising because they may have had these things in their tenancy laws for many years, but other jurisdictions haven't. I'm just going to briefly go through the national 9, the 9 things that we see as key issues in tenancy law reforms and floor for minimum standards in tenancy laws across Australia. I think the first 2 are the most important. Stability and security for renters. So protection against without ground notices to leave, including the end of a fixed term, is imperative to bring some stability and security to renting households. Without this, people's rights are diminished by the fact that they can be asked to leave in retaliatory or discriminatory situations. Coupled with that are issues of affordability. We're calling for limits on rent increases, not just the frequency of those, but the quantum of those, to protect people, to stabilise rents, and to protect people from the very high and unaffordable increases that many sitting tenants have been facing over the last few years. These 2 key issues are both in the platform, except I have to say that the devil will be in the detail with the issue of security and making sure that we do not allow the end of a fixed term to remain as a ground for ending tenancies. In addition, affordability on the National Cabinet platform only includes the limit on the frequency of rent, and without limiting the amount rents can increase, we will see rent increase used as a way to get people out. These 2 things together are the crucial and important bits of rental reform across Australia. In addition, some other important issues: minimum standards for the quality of properties, which need to include energy efficiency so that people can live in safe, accessible and healthy homes. They need to be able to modify their homes, minor modifications, without going through prerequisite approvals when there are only minor issues that make their properties safe and accessible. We need better compliance and accountability of to enforce and give oversight to rental laws. We overly rely on renters to bring forward issues of compliance themselves. We need we need governments to prioritise and be better resourced to respond and support compliance matters. We need to see them proactively enforcing rental laws. We need active regulators, and finally we're calling for a registration of landlords, a simple licensing scheme. We also want to see the management and security of tenants' bonds. Not everywhere across Australia has a centralised collection of bonds and a fair and reasonable process to dispute those claims on bonds and get bonds back quickly. We want to see better protection of private information and protection against discrimination. Many people are giving prospective tenants and tenants are giving a huge amount of private information and often not even getting a property, and we don't really know what's happening with that information. We want to see renters have continued access to free advice and advocacy. They need to, as consumers, they're not always aware of their rights and responsibilities, and then we need to have access to advice to support them to actually understand and express their rights. We also want to see the universal protection of all people who rent their home. Many people who live in more marginal tenures, such as caravan parks, boarding situations, we need to see that they have some rights to protection against arbitrary eviction, rent increases, all of those other things that people in more general tenancies are protected from. And finally, we're calling for better collection, universality and use of data to inform policy and bring greater and better outcomes for people who rent their home. So I guess I just want to say that one of the issues for me, and I'm going to be really interested to hear the panel of speakers, is where to from here. We have heard some announcements from National Cabinet. What are they going to do to ensure these matters are pursued in the states and territories? Are the housing ministers meeting later in the year, which is what we understood to be happening? And I guess what can we as activists do to make sure we do get a better deal for renters? Thanks, Peter.
Thanks very much, Penny, and some important questions for us to discuss there. But we're first going to hear from each of our panellists to give their responses. They've all read the National 9 report and bring different perspectives to bear on it. Our first response comes from the inaugural New South Wales Rental Commissioner, Trina Jones. As Commissioner, Trina seeks to amplify the voice of renters and strengthen their rights and improve the fairness of the rental market. Trina took on the role of Commissioner just in August, and before that she was CEO of Homelessness New South Wales, the peak body for homelessness services in New South Wales and organisations, and she also served as Deputy Chair of Homelessness Australia, the national peak body. So Trina, over to you.
Thank you very much, Peter. And I'd also like to acknowledge the land I'm on today. I'm on Gadigal land, and pay my respects to elders past, present, emerging, and extend that respect to our Aboriginal colleagues on the call. So firstly, congratulations to all of the people who are involved in putting this report together. I can't tell you enough how valuable this is for policymakers and for people who are working in this space to understand the collective intention of how we can strengthen renters' rights across Australia. So I would like to congratulate everyone who's been involved in that, and it's a very useful resource for me as I embark in this new role. And I just wanted to say thank you. So as you rightly said, Peter, I'm 2 months in the role as the New South Wales Rental Commissioner. This role is the first of its kind, and I'm wasting no time getting to work on the priority issues impacting over 2 million renters in New South Wales. As you've said, I'm coming to the role from a background in housing and homelessness, and I understand too well the implications of what can happen when our rental market can't deliver housing for all. I grew up in a social housing community myself, and this has shaped my strong belief that everyone should have a decent and safe place to call home, regardless of their income level or their personal circumstances. And so, as my role as Rental Commissioner, I've carved out 3 priorities that I'm very focused on delivering, and that's for a fair, quality and affordable rental experience in New South Wales. And many of those themes and principles that were reflected in the report, I feel, are captured in the priorities that I'm also working on. So as a representative in government, I'm working with renters and landlords in a whole of government way, and I'm based within fair trading. And so when you talk about the policy and the advocacy piece, but also talk about the regulation piece, this is really where the role of the Rental Commissioner can have enormous potential to bring people together to work smarter for better impact, so that we can deliver those outcomes for community and that we can make that change together. Because we have to remember, any changes that we make are impacting people's lives and their livelihoods in every sense of the way. And so my focus on FAIR is really around how can we improve and modernise residential renting laws. So what does that look like? Well, how can you make a house your home? Penny touched on it. Do you have to ask if you can hang a picture on the wall, if you can have a pet? Why can't you be afforded the same rights that anyone else can in their homes? And so it's about making sure that we can get the balance right there for renters to have more power, more control and more choice. And that also includes security of tenure. And that's why the New South Wales government is very focused on ending no grounds eviction and also making it easier for renters to have pets. And those two are my main priorities as I've started in the role right now, as we make changes through legislation to make sure that those changes can come into effect in the very near future. When we think about FAIR, we're also thinking about, if you have an issue, can you get that resolved in a fair and equitable way? And also, can we eliminate discrimination in the rental process? And how can we work together to achieve that, so that you're not judged based on your background, your race, whether you have children or your income status, and just on your ability to service that rental property, which is the most appropriate criteria to review. I'm also very focused on quality. When we think about quality, we're talking about safe and decent homes. Is a person's home safe? Can they live there, with ease and accessibility? And I think about the safety of the home in the same way we think about cars, right? I talk about this all the time for those who've heard me say it. If you want to drive your car, you've got to get a green slip. That car has to be roadworthy. And that builds trust with the other drivers on the road, that the other cars on the road are safe, they're roadworthy. And you have to, complete that green slip to make that case. But right now in rental properties, well, we've got properties that are out there that we might have legislation that says minimum standards, but not all of those properties meet those minimum standards, as we well know. And what does that mean? Well, they're not rent worthy. And so I'm very focused on making sure that not only can we ensure that the minimum standards are met, but that we have safe and decent homes, and that we have the means to have compliance and enforcement on that. So more than the condition report, where you go around and you decide whether what the condition of the property is in, you can mark the condition as not meeting the minimum standards, and then everybody just goes on about their day. We want to get to a stage where if there's minimum standards are not identified, there's responsibility and accountability to ensure that those homes are safe. I'm also focused on accessibility. We know that for those on the lowest income, there's less than 0.01% of rentals available for them within their price range because of the needs that they may have. And so it's about how can we make sure that our homes are safe and that they're accessible, and that they're also, they have energy efficiency. So I think about energy efficiencies as affordable to live in. And I know that Joel is joining us today, and I've been very inspired by the work of the Better Renting Group with their reports on cold and costly and sweaty and stressed, and some of the recommendations for policymakers there on how we can make homes more livable and affordable into the future. And that brings me to my third outcome focused area, and that's around affordability. When we think about affordability, I will be strongly continuing to advocate for an investment in the supply of social and affordable housing, because we know that just increasing housing supply won't deliver affordability in the rental market. And so the type of supply is critical to ensure that we get the balance right. But I'm also really interested and inspired by the opportunity for us to diversify the rental market in general. Penny already talked about this. We know that people are renting, more people are renting, and more people will be renting into the future for their whole lives. That requires us to rethink renting. It requires a mind shift change. And so for me, I'm very motivated to change the way we think about renting in New South Wales, so that we can have a viable and sustainable rental sector as a key building block for our modern economy and stronger communities. moving away from this idea that renting is the rite of passage before home ownership, when the reality is that many people will be renting for their whole lives. So for that reason, we need to mature the rental market so that tenants can see it as one that offers security, quality, and a genuine choice of tenure, not just what you do if you can't buy. It's actually a genuine choice, and that choice is available in the right locations, and that providers, property providers, owners, investors, well, they can see it as one that they can invest in with certainty and viability, because we know that we don't have landlords without renters, and we can't have renters without landlords. So that idea that we can get a more mature owner investor diversity so that we have more resilience in the market, we get better quality homes, and we get better affordability overall is also a key focus for me. So all of this work has been strongly informed by community. We had a Have Your Say consultation, which I was privileged to be able to walk into and really understand the issues on the ground, from over 16,000 survey responses from residents across New South Wales and over 400 long form submissions. I've also taken what I've learned from that consultation, and I've held roundtables with experts, with renters and property providers and owner investors and landlords and all the different variations of those property providers to say, well, here's what you told us, but what does that really mean, so we can get to the heart of the changes that we need to make. In the 9 weeks I've been in the role, or 10 weeks this week, almost every fortnight I'm meeting with renters and ensuring that their stories and the experiences that they are having in New South Wales are front and centre and being carried all the way through to the highest levels of decision making in the New South Wales government. I'm very committed to making sure that we can make these changes together, and also that we can ensure that any changes in the law are backed up by the regulation, and that we've got the support within fair trading working together to ensure the compliance, safety outcomes are there for renters, reducing those harms and improving our community in general. So I'm very grateful to be here today, and I look forward to having more discussion with the panel.
Thanks so much, Trina. And for anyone outside New South Wales who doesn't know what a green slip is, a green slip is like a roadworthy certificate for your car. I'm sure you picked that up. It's the idea, that a house should be fit to be on the road, as it were. And I think that's a really interesting suggestion, and one we'll pick up in the discussion, along with Joel's question from Better Renting, which has already come through in the Q&A about you don't just need a green slip or a roadworthy certificate, you also need a license to drive a car, and that raises a question about whether the landlords or property owners should have some kind of registration or licensing system as well. We'll come back to those questions. I also want to flag Ruby's question which has come up in the chat, which is about whether New South Wales, and maybe you want to respond to this immediately, Trina, just while I've got you. She said, as I understand it, New South Wales is not removing no grounds evictions at the end of a fixed term, which I think is also what has happened in Queensland, only in continuing agreements. And if that's correct, doesn't it undermine the aim of security?
So right now we're working on the reasonable grounds, and I strongly am advocating that it would apply in all circumstances. So what we really need to see is that if you're ending a tenancy, there's reasons to end that tenancy. And so that's what we're hearing from community. We're making those recommendations, and we make sure that we get the balance right into the future. But those decisions haven't been made yet. We're still having those conversations. It's still on consultation. We're still understanding what the impact of that might be, and making sure that we can formulate all of the feedback from community to make those recommendations. But from my perspective at this stage, I'm very focused on making sure that it's very clear why you can end a tenancy and what settings and why, and also that's clear to renters but also clear to landlords. So I just flag that that's not the
right. That's
the intention.
It hasn't happened yet, and we hope it won't. Because Penny, I'm just going to quickly throw back to Penny Carr in Queensland, because Penny, that's one of the problems in Queensland, I think, isn't it? That the no grounds, the ban on no grounds ending of leases doesn't apply to fixed term tenancies.
Oh, that's right. So, well, Victoria has a better system, but it still allows the ending of an agreement on the basis of the end of the fixed term on the first term of the agreement. But Queensland is perpetual. So most people are on fixed term agreements, and so they still live with this sort of potential to have their tenancy ended for no reason, which is the end of the fixed term, if they're too vocal about repairs or whatever else it is. So it does speak to that ongoing and underlying instability for renters.
Right. And that's a great segue for us to come to Victoria, where there has been significant tenancy law reform, partly, I'm sure, because of the work of Dr. Heather Holst, who is Victoria's inaugural Commissioner for Residential Tenancies. So the first commissioner of that type anywhere in Australia. Heather's been in that role since 2018, and her role includes championing the rights of all Victorian renters, which includes residents of rooming houses or caravan parks or residential parks and specialist disability accommodation and so on. Heather has more than 30 years experience working in housing and homelessness in Victoria, regional Victoria and Melbourne. She was with the Tenants Union and with Launch Housing, and she started as a volunteer and frontline worker and went on to design and operate a range of housing project support programs and rough sleeping solutions. So Heather, over to you.
Thanks, Peter. Hello, everybody. It's great to be part of this conversation today. So I'll start off by paying my respects to the Wurundjeri peoples of the Kulin Nations that I'm coming to you from today. So just a couple of remarks. There's also such a thing in Victoria as a canary, which is a yellow piece of paper that you don't want on your car. And I have had that experience, which actually prevents you driving it until you've got it fixed. So we could develop this theme a bit, I think. So I thought I'd talk to you a little. First of all, I just want to say a couple of things about national consistency. As Peter said in the introduction, I have been at this a long time, and my involvement has coincided with a particularly bad period in policy making when it comes to sort of leaving things to the private sector, frankly. But here we see ourselves coming out of that. I'm optimistic enough to think to much more kind of understanding from all sorts of advocates, actually, including in the property side, the real estate side, that actually social housing is an extremely important part of it all. So my time does coincide with a sort of pushing away by policymakers when it comes to how tenants fare. So we find ourselves now with a lot more private tenants and people who are really not going to really be able to thrive in the conditions that private rental has, and even if we were able to make it considerably better, would still have problems. Nevertheless, we kind of try to make private rental as good as possible. And national consistency only really makes sense when you do have the federal level of government involved as well, which I'm relieved to say we now do have again, because for a long time there we were really not that, we didn't have that impression, certainly in this part of it, much more in homelessness we did, but in this sort of side of things it was the states were left to sort of do, and territories to do what they could. So look, I wanted to just quickly run through the National Nine. It's a good title. Congratulations to the report's authors, and as Peter in particular has remarked, very timely, yes. So I thought I'd talk to you a bit about some of the things that Victoria has just announced. Many of you will have seen or be aware of at least the housing statement that was put out in September by our outgoing, it turned out, Premier. and so that really is worth a look for all of you interested in this area. And I'm going to talk to you a bit about how the renters part of it meshes in. So the stability and security, which Penny calls out as, where you start, as Penny's already said, we do still have the problem of the end of the first term fixed term. Someone can be asked to leave just because it's the end of the first fixed term. This, I think, has been a break on the creation of longer leases, which is a break on the creation of homes. It's a break on it breaks up community. So, I'm very keen to get that out, but that hasn't happened. What we have had is an announcement that if an owner evicts someone at the end of a first term using that provision, they'll not be able to raise the rent for a subsequent tenancy for the next 12 months. This is because there's the data would suggest that some people are just doing that in order to sort of to raise the rent a lot. And in this environment of raising rents, that's clearly going to be on. So that all the details need to come into that, but that is a sort of somewhat further measure that Victoria is going to be taking to try to go towards that security. The other thing that I'd draw your attention to, if you're not familiar with Victoria, is what's called the reasonable and proportionate test. So if someone has received an eviction notice, they can take that matter to the Civil Administrative Tribunal, our VCAT, arguing that actually that's not reasonable and proportionate to whatever it is that they've done wrong or perceived to have done wrong. And we're starting to get quite a few results from that. That actually came about because of a Supreme Court case that one of the Tenants Advocacy Services, colleagues, I can't remember which one, took to argue that that was an important question that any member of the tribunal needed to have in their mind when they were hearing an eviction case, a question of law, really. And that was found in the Supreme Court. And so it's been pushed down into the Residential Tenancies Act in Victoria. And I would just draw those of you who aren't already onto that, draw your attention to it, because it is, and actually, frankly, tenants in Victoria don't know it well enough. And that's that other problem of how they know and exercise their rights. But it is something that's on our books now that is pushing somewhat towards that stability objective. Affordability, yes, well, fair limits on rent increases. We do have something in Victoria which wasn't outlined in the report, which is the right to seek a review and assessment of whether your rent increase is fair. That you seek that from Consumer Affairs. They have sustained a huge demand of those requests, which again speaks to the crisis that's out there in private rental of the escalation. And that's not binding, but it's an extremely important A, negotiating tool, and B, point of evidence if you do go through to VCAT about whether or not the rent's fair. But all of these are not very direct measures, I would say. But tenants are clearly, enough tenants, or so many tenants, are aware of that and are seeking to use it. But yeah, it's not amazing. We have done quite a lot in Victoria around livability, around minimum standards. And this, when people complain, some of the landlords complain about having to invest in their property. This is the sort of thing they mean, that they have to actually bring them up to a standard that they haven't had to before. One thing that we haven't managed to do is get much solar, for example, on roofs. It's really noticeable that the 30% of rental properties are not taking that up, despite an incentive scheme that's being run by the Victorian government. So that's a problem that is going to have to be dealt with in some other method. Just on the compliance and accountability recommendations, one of the big and tricky, I think, to implement well recommendations, not recommendations, but undertakings in the housing statement, is for the development of full-blown alternate dispute resolution. That'll be in conjunction, in parallel with VCAT. So watch this space. We did a fair bit of that during COVID, and there's still some of that going on in order to clear a really immense backlog that has developed at VCAT of cases. But the design of the alternate dispute resolution, so that it is truly and easily accessed and the experience is good for renters, is something that's a bit, I guess, on the edge that we'll be pushing towards. The rental bonds, well, that is in. The Rental Bond Authority has been in place for quite a long time, and we've undertaken in Victoria to investigate a portable loans, portable rental bonds scheme, as has New South Wales. So again, that'll be an interesting one that isn't at all well thought out in detail yet, but will be part of what we need to deliver here. The protection of private information and discrimination. People have absolutely been screaming for this, and it's good to see it in your report, and it's certainly something, again, was in the statement. So we'll be looking at how we can reduce the amount of things that people have to put forward for their applications, where those things are held, how they're used, and you know, that whole catching up with prop tech, I guess. This is part of that theme. But yeah, I'm pleased to see that in there. The access to support and advice and advocacy for renters is very much needed. We've very thin coverage of that compared to the need. So there's a small fund in the housing statement to expand that, but not very big. And I would also remark that renters get a lot of their advice from all sorts of other places. It's actually very interesting where they get that from. And for example, homelessness entry points in Victoria provide a lot of tenancy advice and possibly miss quite a few opportunities to provide other tenancy advice. So we need to be very alert to all the different places that people will naturally go for that information. I absolutely agree with the universality of protections. I don't know if Chris Martin's on the call, but Chris always teases us about how long our Act is in Victoria. And one of the reasons is that it's got different sections for all the other things like rooming houses and specialist disability accommodation, caravan parks, etc. The ones who aren't well covered still, I think, are students. They're really carved out, and I don't think they're a particularly well set up group to stand up, you know, for themselves either. So I think that's an interesting one that we need to think of. And I also don't think share house tenants, while they are covered, many of their particular circumstances aren't well thought through and contemplated there. So I think that what NARO have done here has really sort of been timely. It does seem to really align with where National Cabinet's going, and it is all, as your work will be, reflects what people are coming to you for help and advice with, and that's the secret sauce, really, isn't it? Just one last thing, if I can, Peter. I'm not sure how I'm going with my time, but all right. I just wanted to say, renting at the moment is personal. We all need a home, and that's a very personal matter, but it is sort of much too personal an exchange that's going on, and who we're buying this service off should not know as much as this about us. And there's really a fundamental problem, I think, in the way that private rental is set up in the sort of small holdings of 1 and 2 properties that people have. That can be very effective and good, but there's too much, frankly, amateurish behaviour, and there's too much capture, I would say, by some property managers who are seeking to build a rent roll by basically demonising the people who are renting the properties. So I think we've got a fundamental issue of the underpinnings of our private rental sector, which, you know, the build to rent sector has become alert to. Obviously, community housing and social housing always knew about. And, you know, there's a couple of new things coming in, like the interesting Longview project that's also going on in Victoria. But I just, sorry to be a bit of a downer, but that fundamental of how it's structured is actually going to continue to be a problem for us. But on we go. Thanks, Peter.
Thanks very much, Heather, and a whole lot of stuff that I'd like to pick up on there in the conversation if we could. But it struck me that what you talk about with VCAT and the precedent set by the Supreme Court, the trouble is it's always in retrospect, right? The tenant still has to be the one to take the responsibility to go to VCAT and enforce their rights. And as we know, tenants may often get repair orders from VCAT that the owner then ignores, and unless they go back to the Supreme Court, and so on. But the idea of a quick system of full-blown dispute resolution, that sounds, I think, really a positive thing as well. So look, we'll come now to our next 2 speakers. And there's some great comments in the chat. I noticed Chris Martin is attending, Heather, and he says the Victoria's rental tenancy legislation is longer than Dickens' Great Expectations. So yeah. Okay, our next speaker is Melisa Coveney, the principal lawyer at Darwin Community Legal Service. That's the specialist legal service for tenants in the Northern Territory. Melisa has dedicated a career to the community legal sector with a passion for residential tenancy reform and housing justice. She began amassing her professional experience as a tenant advocate in Southwest Sydney before joining Darwin Community Legal Service. Melisa was principal lawyer with the North Australian Aboriginal Family Legal Service. assisting victim survivors of family and domestic violence in remote communities across the top end. Melisa.
Thank you, Peter. I would like to acknowledge the Larrakia people, who are the traditional owners of the land that I am living and working on, and I pay my respects to elders past and present. So as Peter said, DCLS, or Darwin Community Legal Service, is a generalist community legal centre in the Northern Territory. We have a few different arms of our service, one of which is our residential tenancy advice service. We currently have 4 specialist lawyers working in the area of residential tenancy, and that service covers the whole of the Northern Territory. We're the only residential tenants advice service to not receive any Commonwealth funding. So all of our funding comes from the state government. Currently close to 50% of our population are renters, so there's a very high proportion of renters in the Northern Territory. 30% of our population identify as First Nations people. We have a general reputation for poor living conditions, as can be seen by the Santa Teresa case, excessive rents, and a very tight rental market, which all leads to it exacerbates the current rental prices, even more so for people living in the Northern Territory. We've been advocating for change for a very long time, as all the other tenants advice services have been. And we're very pleased that the National Cabinet has highlighted tenancy reform as a priority area. Excuse me. And we're hopeful that this will see changes not only nationally, but specifically in the NT, to bring us in line with other jurisdictions. We are currently woefully behind other jurisdictions in terms of our residential tenancies legislation. So currently our tenancy can be terminated with no grounds by giving a 42-day notice for a periodic tenancy and a 14-day notice for a fixed term tenancy. We're the only jurisdiction that does not have a residential tenancy bond board. So currently all bonds paid by tenants are held by landlords and agents, which leads to the majority of the calls that we get through on our tenants advice service is in relation to bonds, and landlords and owners and agents withholding bonds from tenants, which again leads to the issue of tenants having to then enforce their rights to make an application to NTCAT to try and get that bond returned. It's our most prevalent issue here is bonds. So as I said, not only do we still have no cause evictions, we have very limited notice periods for those evictions. We currently have the lowest prescribed notice periods for rent increases, which is 30 days, and the lowest prescribed limit on rent increases, which is 6 months. We say that the majority of people in the Northern Territory are living in housing stress. We have people call through with rent increases having their rent doubled. The current vacancy rate in the Northern Territory is sitting at 0.8, and the median rents have increased by almost 50% for units and 40% for houses since 2020. There's also been no major review of the residential tenancy legislation or reform in the NT. In 2010, the Northern Territory government drafted an issues paper highlighting the inadequacies of the current out-of-date legislation. Still no changes were made. In 2018, the Northern Territory government committed to a comprehensive review of the Residential Tenancies Act. In 2019, a discussion paper was released for the review of the Act. In 2020, we had one amendment which introduced pets. So pets were now allowed in residential tenancies. Since then, there has been no other reform. Last week, we were very happy to hear that the Northern Territory government is looking at a new tranche of amendments to the Act, following on from the 2020 amendments. We currently have an overview of those amendments, but we're yet to see a draft bill, which we've been told will be introduced in the October sittings of Parliament. So seems like a fairly quick turnaround. Many of the proposed reforms are in line with the National Cabinet principles, which we do welcome. However, we're yet to see any of the overview of the reforms and how they are actually going to work in principle. Sorry, I just lost my place. We say that it's imperative that both the territory and federal governments take proactive measures to establish equitable, secure and dependable tenancy framework. We would love to see all jurisdictions have adequate protection for renters. We would love to be in line with some of the other jurisdictions and not be quite so far behind in our Residential Tenancies Act. I'd like to thank NARO for their wonderful report, and it was a pleasure to be a part of creating that report. And so thank you for all of your hard work and tireless efforts to continue to fight for a fairer system for renters.
Thanks very much, Melissa. And I think the situation in the Northern Territory, I read Melissa's submission to the current Committee on Australia's Rental Crisis, and it reminds us, it's interesting how far a state like Victoria or the ACT have come, but yet how much further there is to go. So anyway, let's get a view from the West. Our final speaker, Daniel Pritchard, is a senior lawyer at Circle Green Community Legal. That's the specialist service for residential tenancy law in WA. Daniel was admitted to practice in 2018 and has worked his entire career in community legal centres, and started at Circle Green in 2021. Daniel.
Howdy. Yes, I'm coming to you from the lands of the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation. So I'd just like to take a moment to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Continuing on with the theme, in Western Australia, we have yellow stickers, I think, which, given the bomb cars that I have owned in my time, I'm pretty lucky not to have seen one. So my first reflection when reading the NARO report was one which is pretty familiar to Western Australians as a whole, which is we're pretty behind the eastern states. We're getting things a bit later than everyone else. So reflecting on the themes, for example, of livability and minimum standards, we presently don't have minimum standards in our legislation. We only have a provision that requires landlords to maintain properties in a reasonable state of repair. Being a lawyer, I know that there's a lot of work that you can do with the word reasonable. And given that our system requires tenants to enforce their rights to the Magistrates Court of Western Australia, which doesn't generate any precedent which we can provide to tenants, it's a lot to get a tenant to go to court with a pretty slim piece of legislation and expect a consistent result. Similarly, in the concept on the theme of universality of protections for all people, the Western Australian legislation does not have any protections for boarders and lodgers within our legislation, and does not even include a statutory definition for what it is to be a boarder and lodger. So in that same theme, people who may be boarders and lodgers are required to basically draw a conclusion from the common law as to whether they may or well not be a boarder and lodger, and then if they are a boarder and lodger, again, draw conclusions from the common law. I myself am pretty bad with the common law, so it's a pretty big job to expect the everyday renter to be able to make those decisions and kind of draw a conclusion that gives them a solid understanding of what their rights and obligations are. I think we're in the middle of a review of our Residential Tenancies Act in Western Australia. So there's a lot of, I think, hope on the horizon for us in terms of some of the announcement that our state government has already made, including entrenching or legislating for the right for people to make modifications and have pets, increasing our rent increases from once every 6 months up to once every 12 months. And there's also on the horizon, there's some reforms planned to be consulted on in respect of having minimum standards entrenched in our legislation, and having protections for boarders and lodgers. Unfortunately, the one thing that's missing from all of that has been the removal of without grounds from our legislation, without grounds termination. So prior to the National Cabinet meeting in August, our government did announce that they were not planning to remove without grounds terminations from our legislation. We are yet to see any reversal of that position from or subsequent to the National Cabinet announcements. It's disappointing because from the very inception of residential tenancy legislation, it's been highlighted that without grounds is essentially creates a pathway for landlords to act in a retaliatory manner to where tenants seek to enforce those rights. That's been, the dialogue for 30, 40 years now, that avenue exists, and that's the reason to not have without grounds in our legislation. And that's consistent with the feedback that we've seen in the report. I believe it cites the Disrupted report, where 44% of renters felt that enforcing repairs or seeking that a landlord has repairs done in their property would result in their eviction. And our own Make Renting Fair campaign in Western Australia conducted a similar survey and found that 42% of renters were fearful that without grounds terminations they would be given a notice of termination if they sought to enforce their obligations. Our own 10-year housing and homelessness plan from our state government in Western Australia highlights the importance of providing stable accommodation. So it is disappointing to not see them make good on that by removing without grounds from the current legislation. I understand that there are obstacles to the removal of without grounds. Chief amongst those is the fear that it will cause property investors to, remove their properties from the market, perhaps blow them up, or perhaps place them onto other forms of tenure, such as Airbnb. And there is some work now being done in Western Australia. It was recently announced to limit the amount of, or to regulate the Airbnb market to make it not so easy for the removal of those properties from the private rental market. But it is something that I think is very important that we see now in the short term, because whilst there is, significant investment in public housing to protect the interests of low-income earners and the ability of low-income earners to sustain tenancies, when we're practically going to see that, investment in public housing translate to actual houses for those low-income earners is going to be, I think, a pretty long frame timeline. And in the current market where people are struggling to maintain tenancies because of the financial constraints of doing so, I think that just today there came out the Food Bank's the hunger report that said that I believe it was around 3 million households were in hunger insecurity. This needs to change to now to give people the ability to sustain tenancies and not incur the ongoing costs of moving out, having to change their property every 1 or 2 years when given a without grounds notice of termination. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Daniel. And yeah, that Food Bank report is one of the reasons why when we talk about poverty or income inequality in Australia, we should be talking about it after housing costs are taken into account, because everyone has to pay for housing, and it's not it's the real poverty discrepancies and levels are post rent or post housing costs. Look, we've now got about half an hour for questions, and there's a bunch of questions there. I'm going to try and move through some of them pretty rapidly. So the first question at the top of the list, being voted to the top of the list by Chase. Speaking of minimum standards, why aren't heating and cooling compulsory for all rentals across Australia? This goes to the idea of minimum standards as foreseen by National Cabinet in the Better Deal for Renters. Anyone who's read that appendix to the National Cabinet meeting will probably be tearing their hair out, because what it said in terms of examples of minimum standards were hot and cold water and a working stove. And that was it's like nothing about mold, nothing about locking doors or opening windows. So what I want to, I'm going to put to the panelists that, of course, heating and cooling should be a minimum standard. Does anyone disagree with that should be in the minimum standards? So I think that I think all our panelists agree that should be a minimum standard. It should be something. So I won't take another question there. We've also had concern when we've raised, and I'll come to you on this, Heather, the question of build to rent as an emerging form and increasing the I suppose, the level of supply and perhaps the diversity of offerings in our market away from the small-scale investor with 1 or 2 properties to professionalise the market. It's been pointed out that in places like the USA and indeed in Germany too, some of these institutional investors are proven to be awful landlords, slum landlords, you might say, forcing people out of rent-protected dwellings, etc., etc. So I'd just give you a chance to respond to that concern, Heather.
I think it is a concern. I was up at the National Housing Conference, as probably quite a few of you were in Brisbane the other week, and one of the remarks that I think Susan Lloyd-Hurwitz made, who's chairing, well, I guess it's now called Housing Australia, was that it's not as if it's good now. So I think that was something to think about. She also remarked that those other jurisdictions where, you know, Blackstones and, you know, some of those other big owners of property absolutely are ripping the hearts out of communities, and they get a much higher rent yield compared to the value of the property in those jurisdictions. I don't fully understand the implications of that, but she seemed to feel that that was a protection somewhat for us here that I need to investigate further. But the fact of the matter is that build to rent is sort of coming. You know, there's quite a few projects underway, and so the experiment is on foot, I would say. So it's going to be interesting to see, and it's going to be important for all tenant advocates to be sure before the negotiating power gets absolutely huge that, you know, the protections for tenants are in there. So I would say that it's certainly concerning, but it's also something that's coming, and it's not as if it's great now in the private sector. Be a few remarks.
Yeah, certainly true. And one of the questions, I think, was clearly it's going to be a question around regulation, but also what do we mean by build to rent? Because there are developers who want to have it both ways. They want to be able to rent things out for 10 years and then sell, which would possibly maximise the capital gain. Trina, you wanted to speak on this as well?
Look, I think this is a really interesting conversation to have, because if we look at Australia's current makeup of landlords, if you like, we only have 1% that are large corporate landlords. And I completely agree with the concerns, and the point around the rented yield, though, is an important one. And I do think this is a protection in Australia, because right now the money to be made in renting isn't on the actual money that's returned from the rent, the yield. The money's in the dirt. So it's actually the capital growth for the sale of the property over time is where most people make their money. And so the build to rent, and I've been speaking to a lot of institutional investors while in this role and previously, the build to rent scene is not necessarily a product that will deliver affordable housing. I think we do need to keep that front of mind, because the stack of their capital stack doesn't necessarily work for them to deliver an affordable product without a significant government subsidy. So I do think that it's separate to the delivery of social and affordable housing, and I don't think it can replace that conversation. I think it can talk about adding to supply. But in terms of protection for renters, because of the infancy, as Heather rightly pointed out, of this in Australia and particularly in New South Wales, I think it's even more advanced in Victoria. We have a great opportunity to put those protections in from the start and to ensure that that's an appropriately regulated and managed sector and market that emerges. And so we have some tools available to us in the planning process, which we already have underway in New South Wales, to incentivise the institutional investment in residential dwellings. But we also have, at the same time, in step the considerations around the regulation, working with the industry to ensure that we can deliver quality homes and choice for renters, depending on their income scale, of course. There is a conversation to be had around the build to rent model for affordable housing, but let's face it, that's just community housing. Social and community housing is built to be rented, and so we don't need to get too complicated about those things. There's some good models there emerging through the investment from the HAF, and that we'll be able to see play out in New South Wales. The Housing Australia Future Fund, which is that investment in money that can stand up social housing alongside the social housing accelerator funds that are coming from Commonwealth. So that's a long way of saying there is money coming into the market for social and affordable housing. Build to rent will be a major complement to that. There's a great opportunity for us to create the framework for institutional investment, but it will take tax reform, it will take working with industry, and it will likely take us to ensure that the regulations are really right from the beginning.
Great, thanks, Trina. So this is a question from Alistair Sisson, and it's about Principle 9, and especially to both the commissioners here, which is the one about better evidence, better data collection, and the report suggests a bond exit survey, which would provide data from people as they get their bonds back, or presumably if we had a transferable bond, Heather, as they transfer their bond, because having transferable bond would make a lot of difference to renters who don't have to then double up the bond as paying a new one as they wait to get their old one back. So what do you think about, or what other ideas would you have? We don't have anyone from any of the residential tenancy authorities that hold these bonds, but as to how we could get better data.
I think that exit survey, which I believe has been done in New South Wales I'm sorry, I don't know if it's ongoing, but it has been good. I have a sort of bigger beef, I suppose, about the lack of real-time data from the renter's perspective. We've got a lot of housing data in Australia that you can, access anytime you open a newspaper, whatever version you use. But really none of it is from the perspective of a renter wanting to know, what they should do, what their options are. It's for housing investors and buyers, really. So I think that the data question, I completely concur with NARO on this, that there's a lot more that needs to be done. And I like their call for it to be sort of open and shared so that all manner of people with an interest can have a look and use it in their own work or to generate their own ideas. So I'm absolutely back that, and I think it's an untapped resource. I agree. You were muted then, Peter. Yeah.
We
that's an old trick. Yeah, Trina, go ahead.
Yeah, so we have the end of tenancy survey currently operating here in New South Wales, and we're already in discussions about how we can strengthen that and streamline that. And also, so I'm very close to the bonds here, Peter, and work on that here. And so we're looking at ways to maximise the intelligence from that, but also what's all the data points across government in terms of renting, and how can we bring those through to more of an open access or public access way that can help everybody do better and make everybody have more informed decisions. And that's something that I'm very passionate about and very interested in continuing to work with the Tenants Union and others here in New South Wales to get right. So please watch this space.
Thanks, Trina. Melisa or Daniel, did you want to add anything here on this evidence? Okay. Look, I mean, that goes to a question that Leo has put from the Tenants Union New South Wales, saying, we're coming up to 50 years of tenancy reform coming out of the Commonwealth Government Poverty Inquiry. And every time there's a suggested reform, the industry screams that, people are going to withdraw their housing, we're not going to have enough, investors are going to withdraw from the market, we won't have enough homes, et cetera, et cetera. So the question is, how do we build an evidence-based discussion rather than having one that is so heavily influenced by unevidenced claims from industry? Any thoughts there from any of our panelists?
Look, I'd just like to call out the work that Dr. Chris Martin and Huri have done on disinvestment in the regulation in the residential tenancy market, and that longitudinal study on Victoria and New South Wales is invaluable for policymakers and for everybody really who's interested in this. I think we also need to go back to the evidence. This is a point that I made at the National Housing Conference as well, and the evidence doesn't bear this out, right? We haven't seen a significant decrease in bonds. And we know that, yes, investor sales are up, and we have seen that number increase in New South Wales. For example, they're up 10%, but also new investor loans are also up 25% or more. So there's sellers, but there's buyers, and sellers are buyers. So it's not this linear path that means that if you sell your property, you'll never invest again. I do know that the ABC did some coverage on this over the weekend, and yes, maybe that is the case for a number of people, but potentially they were not suited to be long-term owner investors anyway. And so we need to think about, if it's a very unique investment, right? It's somebody's home. And if you're interested in making that an investment, then there's responsibilities, rights, absolutely, but also responsibilities that are accompany that. And so we'll be sticking to the evidence to show that the regulation to date hasn't resulted in disinvestment. And I agree. I think there's an opportunity for us to pool that evidence to better educate the broader public on the real impacts, which are benefits.
Yeah. Thanks, Trina. And I'd also call out the work that Joel and others at Better Renting have done to try and change the way we talk about this whole sector. And Joel, feel free to whack your report in the chat so other people can see it. But, you know, this, for example, the way we can, you know, the language that is used quite deliberately to talk about mum and dad investors when, as we know, the benefits of the tax system flowing to investors flow mostly to people on very high incomes. And we know all of that stuff, but I think we have to keep plugging away with journalists who write about housing to pick them up and say, you know, get your facts right. Heather, you wanted to jump in?
Yes, just on a more optimistic note, it absolutely is always the noise, isn't it, Leo? But you know, the arc is progressive, to misquote someone much greater than me. But it has been more and more rental rights in that term. I discovered something called distraint when I was looking at old landlord-tenant stuff, which was the right of the owner of the property, the landlord, to hop in through a window and seize some of your goods if you had a debt. You know, this took this took a world war to get out of the act. So you know, there is we're coming from a very low point basically. But yeah, that background noise about disinvestment is very, very difficult.
Melisa or Daniel, any thoughts here?
I mean, just speaking from the Western Australian context, most of the stuff that we are seeking to have reformed has already been done in other states. And, you know, we can generally point to something where it's been done, for example, in the ACT or Victoria and say, well, it's being done here and the housing market doesn't collapse. But the noise is still going to be there. So I think, unfortunately, that you're always going to have people who are, you know, contrarian to the things that the common sense approach to the reforms, but you know, there's plenty of evidence out there that the market's not going to collapse.
Yeah, thanks, Daniel. And unfortunately, all the reforms that happen in other states don't magically create utopia for tenants either, but they make incremental gains, I guess. So I want to come to a question from Patricia. We see the constant, and this goes to another kind of, I suppose, dominant discourse around housing, which is the problem is one of supply. We just need to build more, and if we get, you know, so we've got the government's National Housing Accord to build 1.2 million homes over 5 years. Personally, I don't think that's going to be met because market conditions aren't suitable, but that's another issue. The focus here is on, you know, supply, and then more supply, rents will come down and solve the problems. And I wonder what any of our panelists think about this dominant discourse around supply.
Look, Peter, I think I said in my opening statement, the evidence shows us time and again that more supply won't deliver more affordability. And I think it's very important that we recognise that while there is an ambitious and courageous target around 1.2 million homes, this is what we need. Okay, so this isn't like a lofty target. This is what's needed to deliver the housing supply for those. And that's why it's supported by programs like the Housing Australia Future Fund and the Social Housing Accelerator and the incentivisation of states who do reach their housing targets, because that is ambitious. And we know that in New South Wales alone, we'll have to build 75,000 homes. But we know that also of those 75,000, we must see a significant percentage be social and affordable housing. I'm an advocate for 10% social housing and will continue to be, because we know that that's what's actually needed to meet the needs of the most vulnerable low-income renters. So I think we have to make sure that when we have the conversation about supply, that's true. More supply is needed, more supply of all types, but more diverse supply is needed to deliver affordability.
Okay, thanks, Trina. Look, a couple more questions. I mean, I want to go to some, I suppose, some ambitious ideas here. So, for example, Mignon has asked, why can't the federal government tie incentives such as negative gearing and capital gains discounts to rental reforms? Do we see, I mean, I think many of us would argue those things themselves, negative gearing and capital gains discount, need reform in themselves. But I mean, the point is here that property investors are getting a benefit from government in the form of tax expenditures, tax concessions. Shouldn't they therefore then, and many are also getting a benefit from government in terms of Commonwealth rent assistance flowing to them via tenants, shouldn't there be some greater responsibility in return for those benefits that property investors get? Any thoughts from?
This is where the politics comes in, isn't it? And yes, these are all good arguments, but you have to have a mandate to enact them. And you know, I think most of the people on this call would be absolutely yes, obvious. That's what's got to be done. But you know, it's the mandate to do it, and our governments do have to represent all parts of our great country and all opinions. So I'm not a politician, but that is over to the people who have to decide whether they can take those decisions, right or wrong.
Penny? I think you're on mute, Penny.
I kind of echo what Heather's saying. I think we do actually have a lot of solutions to the problems, but it's implementing them, and the current Commonwealth government, the Albanese government probably is a little bit gun-shy from the 2019 election, from some of the policies they brought forward. But also I think it's very hard to mobilise renters, and I think we have this narrative and this paradigm that we live in, and the expectations renters have are so low, and they've you know, we all think, oh, it's someone else's property.
Oh, I think Penny's frozen there, unfortunately. Connection, obviously, unless I'm the one. No. Okay, so we'll move on. I'm sorry about that, Penny. So another a question is about, well, a reference to Germany as the rights of renters, where the renters have greater protections. Of course, more than half of German households are rental households. More than half of the population live in rental households. But I guess this goes to what we can learn from overseas. And Heather, I know you've looked at sort of Scandinavian examples. What else we might learn from examples overseas that could inform Australia's private rental market?
Would you like me to say something there? Sorry.
Yeah, Heather, please. Yeah.
Okay. Look, I think it's a little bit like Daniel was saying with WA. You know, you can look to the other jurisdictions and say, look, it can work. I think that is extremely helpful. That's why I like these sort of discussions today, for example. But we do also have to understand that our civic basis is significantly different sometimes, and it's not as easy. For example, Finland on homelessness, marvellous, but really uphill to do that sort of thing in Australia. It doesn't mean you don't fix your eyes on it and get towards it, but we do need to understand that our kind of basic underpinnings, our sort of part of our sort of national agreement with each other isn't the same, and they're the sort of bigger picture things that we also need to be working on. We all were dealt a big lesson with that with the referendum just recently, weren't we? Of who votes and how they vote, who understands things how they do. So sorry, that's a little bit high level and philosophical, but I think the best use of some of those international examples is to inspire us and to make us think about what could be brought here and made local. Yeah.
And any of our other panelists want to offer thoughts there on what else we might learn from other jurisdictions?
I think there's some really great examples that we can absolutely learn from. I agree with Heather. And building on that, I just think it's about getting that local context right as well, because you can't necessarily copy and paste because it's not always the exact same settings, but it doesn't mean that you shouldn't seek to learn from others. And as commissioners, that's something that we talk about regularly. Heather and I talk about, you know, we're learning from others all the time, and how could it apply in the local contexts, and really, you know, taking that community-based perspective and listening to renters in our own communities and understanding what's happening for them, and trying to take the best practice and apply it to those contexts is where we'll get the best outcomes, I think, into the future.
So I crashed out then, so my apologies for that. I don't know what went wrong there, but look, we've we're running out of time, and I'm sorry I haven't got to all your questions. There's a ton of great questions there, and I appreciate the fact that so many of you have been answering one another's questions. There's some great answers there as well. I think I'm just going to whip through a few points that are being made here. One, Linda Hahn's point about there needs to be much greater engagement with the real estate industry as the kind of intermediary, and there are good questions there about professionalisation of that industry. There are no kind of continuing professional development programs for, and the regulation of real estate agents is all around selling and buying, not around the managing of tenancies. We've got good questions about people who are not seen as ordinary tenants, like people in residential villages, like retirement villages and so on. We've got a whole lot of great questions there, and I'm sorry we don't get to all of them, but I'm just going to whip around our panel now and invite any final comments you may have. I'll come to Daniel first, and then Melisa, and then Heather and Trina. Any last thoughts for the panel? Daniel?
Yes, so I was just answering someone's question. Yeah, so I think what needs to be understood is that a lot of these changes, these reforms that are being sought are urgent in nature. Like they can't just kind of sit on the plate for the next 5-10 years. If you've read, there's a report by Kimberley Community Legal Centre called Stuck in the Heat, which talks about the effects of global warming on tenancies in the top end of Western Australia, in the Kimberley and Pilbara regions, particularly the Kimberley region. And it says that by the year 2030, there's going to be the majority of towns in the Kimberley region are going to have over 200 days a year exceeding 35 degrees temperature. We currently don't have a requirement, an express requirement in our Act to have air conditioning. And that's going to result in a lot of tenancies where people are at a health risk or just cannot continue to live there anymore. And when you think particularly about the fact that a lot of those tenancies are Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, there's a good chance that those people, if they're not adequately protected, will be forced off their country because they can no longer sustain a tenancy in those areas. So I think if we just let this sit on the plate for another 5 or 10 years, the problem's already going to be there. These reforms need to be put through now to ensure that by the time that we're dealing with this climate crisis, those people are adequately protected at that time.
Thanks, Daniel. Well, scary, but also profoundly important point that you're making there. Melisa, final thoughts from you?
I just wanted to sort of mirror what Daniel has said, particularly in relation to the remote Aboriginal communities in the top end, who are just living in horrific conditions a lot of the time, and absolutely no thought about minimum standards of habitability. And that is definitely something that needs to be improved urgently. And I agree that a lot of the reforms need to happen quickly and can't be left to go on forever. We're very happy that there's been a spotlight on residential tenancy reform that there wasn't previously, and we look forward to seeing some changes implemented from that.
Thanks, Melisa. And I think one of the issues that came through probably in the chat and in the questions, and also in the report and in your own submission, is around the kind of difference between public, community, and the private rental market, and tenants' rights might be better protected in public than in the community sector, depending again from state to state. But as we're seeing that shift to much more community housing, not-for-profit community housing and private providers, and away from public housing, that's another area where we need to think about. Heather, final thought from you?
Just to keep in mind, which I think many of you do, the problem of being able to exercise your rights, and that it's okay to have them on the books, but if you don't feel able to exercise them. So let's put a lot of our energy into that, and let's remember the extra problem of discrimination, particular discrimination on the basis of race, I would say, in housing is absolutely massive, and I don't think yet we've got very good methods of dealing with that.
Thanks, Heather. And it comes back to that issue of it not being up to the tenant to complain, but there being sort of proactive regulation, and we're certainly a long way from that in every state and territory, as far as I can see. Trina, final word from you.
Thank you again for including me in this conversation today. I think the real challenge ahead, but there's also an opportunity for many of us who've been working in housing. I'm sure you'll agree that the stars have never aligned in a way like this before. And I think that with that comes an enormous potential for us to really get things to make massive advancements in a way that we haven't been able to before. You know, that great quote that change happens slowly, then all of a sudden. And I think that we're in that moment right now. And it's because of the work of NARO and the tenants unions and the renters advocates across the country that we can really use the platform to launch lasting and meaningful change. So for me, I'm really heartened and motivated by this session today. I'm listening and will take forward the recommendations where we can to make that change in New South Wales. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Trina. And look, thank you to all of you for your questions and comments. Sorry I didn't get to them all, and sorry my internet dropped out. I'm now connecting via my mobile phone hotspot, but glad that we've been able to get through the hour and a half. We needed at least another hour to talk about all these issues and much more to discuss. But let me hand back to Penny to close proceedings. Thanks, Penny.
Thanks very much, Peter. And my computer decided just to automatically update itself, so apologies, I was offline for a little bit of time. Also, I just want to add a final comment before I thank people. I think as renters, as friends and family of renters, we need to raise our expectations with politicians. 1 in 3 of us rent our homes, and we need a better system. So if you can do anything following today, please write to your state and federal MP and raise these issues with them and tell them these things do need to change, because it's only by raising our voices that we will see change coming. So just in closing, I want to thank a few people. Peter Mears, thank you very much for your time. It's really very generous of you to donate your time today and to guide us through the conversation. To all the panellists, Melisa, Danielle, Heather, Trina, thank you very much for your time as well. To all my colleagues across other tenants unions and other organisations represented on the panel, thank you so much for the time and effort that's taken to get the report together. Everyone participating today, thank you for your interest, and please take this conversation further. A special thank you call out to Tenants Union New South Wales, who did a lot of work in getting today together. Thank you for that administrative support, and in particular, a big call out to Jemima and Rathi. Thanks so much. Have a great afternoon, and yeah, let's get a better deal for renters.